Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxton. Today we are delighted to welcome the businessman and former Brexit Party MEP, Jake Pugh. Jake Pugh, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Thanks, Jonathan. Delighted to join you.
Jake, let's get right into the discussion. Obviously, we've had this quite severe lockdown in the UK. It's something we've seen across the entire planet due to the global coronavirus crisis. What's been your assessment so far of how the UK government has handled the crisis?
Yeah, well, I think it's too easy to be critical across the board. I think it's clearly unprecedented. I believe in some senses the government had prepared for a pandemic, but a flu pandemic rather than a viral pandemic. So you can't be prepared for every pandemic. I think there's a lot of focus now on the projections, the imperial projections of a mortality rate of 250,000 or 500,000. I think, however one looks at it, for a Prime Minister, British Prime Minister, to ignore those kind of potential death numbers, however much one interrogated a model, because ultimately you'd just be interrogating assumptions. I think it would have been pretty difficult for a Prime Minister to ignore that. Because if they did, and then those death numbers did come in, and there was like, right, so you were warned there was going to be a death toll of 250,000 and you decided not to act on it. So I think however much people say, yeah, they should have really interrogated Professor Ferguson's kind of model and all the rest of it, I think it'd be pretty difficult for a British Prime Minister to ignore that, however concerned they were about some of the assumptions in the model. So I think we have to be reasonable about that, and I think, in a sense, they had to overstate the risks in order for the lockdown to be effective, which, again, I think is reasonable. But I think from there on, it's not been so good. I mean, to me, it's one of the very sensitive areas in British politics, is talking about the NHS. And, you know, whenever one criticises anything in the public sector, you're immediately kind of assuming you're criticising the individuals who work there, which is kind of not the point at all. So there's a completely different thing, which is the motivations of, you know, the honest, honourable, fantastic motivations of people who work in the NHS versus how the thing is organised. And clearly it's a kind of, you know, a failure of the public sector, yet another failure of the public sector. Because if you have a point where you're trying to prevent the NHS, you need to protect the NHS from doing what it needs to do, then kind of what's the point? So I think, you know, whilst the lockdown was effective, all the stuff around, you know, availability of PPE, the care home situation. I mean, when this first broke, you know, it's very simple information. There's 450,000 people in care homes. You know, that obviously needs to be a priority. So I think they've had a lot of issues. It's interesting this morning, actually, Jonathan, I'm sure you've seen that at the moment the government seems to be run through the various articles they author or, you know, sponsor in the Telegraph, basically saying that Boris Johnson's going to take control. Well, what's been? I don't think that's a great headline. You know, what's been happening for the last few weeks if he hasn't been in control. So I actually think that one of my big things about politics and linking it in COVID, politicians are terrified of telling people the truth, what they discover. So to me, I think it would be perfectly reasonable to say, look, we have this projection of an incredibly high number of deaths. Although we had concerns about the model, that was not something we could ignore. We had to overstate the risks in order for COVID, in order for the lockdown to be effective. But actually, we've discovered that the death rate is particularly focused on those with pre-existing health conditions or elderly or whatever it happens to be. So you can say, right, we've actually changed our view in the last couple of months on the basis of what we've seen, and therefore we're going to do the following. I just think people would understand that. But when they sort of, governments and politicians think, right, I've committed to this 5 stages, these 5 tests, right, I now can't change that at all. I think popular British people are incredibly sophisticated and more than capable of understanding a narrative that said, we were really concerned, we now have a lot more information, and now we'd like to change. Whereas what we've really seen is the government is really kind of changing it by stealth and sort of leaving it down to people to make their own judgment. I mean, I'm perfectly happy with that, actually. I don't really need the state to tell me how to behave. But so I think it's been increasingly confusing, and they certainly need to, from a political perspective, need to give the impression of being much more in control of the situation.
Jake, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'd like to talk a little bit in a moment about the Chancellor's policies on the economic side and mitigating the effects of lockdown. You said a few things there I'd like to pick up on. First, you mentioned the NHS. Do you think what we have seen with this crisis is likely to catalyse reforms in the public sector?
Unfortunately, I'm a realist. No, I think that I hope it does, but but I'm sceptical as to whether it does. I'm notwithstanding his behaviour in the last couple of weeks, because clearly Dominic Cummings was completely making it up about the trip to Barnacastle. I mean, everybody can see through that. It's just a complete nonsense to test your eyesight. It's his wife's birthday. He just needs to come clean and say it. But generally speaking, I think Cummings' philosophy around you need to change the structures of British government and the whole way in which policy is developed and implemented, and that would include, the operation of the NHS. That is the single most important thing, because you can have the best policies in the world, but unless you can actually implement the things, and that is the biggest problem that I see in the UK. And really, Brexit, which of course we'll talk about, is an enabler for that. So I'm very much aligned with, from a philosophical perspective, Cummings' perspective, that Cummings' approach, that we really need to change the way in which policy is developed and then implemented. That's the biggest challenge. So, specific to your question, is it going to lead to a review of how, at the edges? Because you're going to have the same people doing the review who have, kind of managed the organisation. So I think you need really radical reform in how government is kind of managed. That's a really big thing we need to do.
Jake, you also spoke about the government coming clean with people. Do you think that from their perspective, they would feel they would have a credibility issue if they said perhaps they had got some things wrong in the initial stages?
Why would that lead? I mean, I think I just don't think it's an issue to say, this is the basis upon which we made this judgment and proceeded on that basis. And then whatever the virus has told us a number of things, or either about death rate or about the best way to deal with it or those most vulnerable. I think the British people are completely capable of understanding that. And I mean, in a way, your question the framing of your question sort of says, it sort of illustrates the issue of sort of saying, we got it wrong. What's so bad about that? And I'll give you another, of course, Brexit related example is if you go back to the accession of the A8 countries and Tony Blair waiving the rights the UK government had in terms of free movement for the Eastern European countries. So he waived that right. And the reason he waived that right, if you read all the materials, is the time we were the economy was starting to overheat. And there was a report done by the Bank of England, the Treasury, basically saying, well, actually, inflationary pressures are building 04, 05 in the economy. So Tony Blair took a decision to basically waive the phasing in of freedom of movement. He waived those rights as the UK had. And he did it for, let's say, for the best intentions of trying to balancing that against the needs of the economy. Tell people that. Have the guts to tell people. People might not like it, but at least they'd understand why you did it. And politicians, and so much of this is driven by the media. It's kind of, it's gotcha, you've got to give quick answers, simplistic answers all the time. And that's, so I don't think there's any issue with saying, I thought the following, I did the analysis, this led me to this conclusion, I've now seen more evidence, so therefore I've changed my mind. Why is that? I just don't see that as an issue at all. I think politicians see it as an issue. I don't think it's one for the British people at all.
Now, turning to the government's response, Jake, what has been your assessment of the Chancellor's policies? We've had this huge furlough scheme. We've had many schemes rolled out. There've been a lot of praise for these schemes. There've been some criticisms too, compared, for example, to the ease with which a similar scheme was rolled out in Switzerland. How would you assess the Treasury's response so far?
Yeah, well, as you know, Jonathan, sort of economics and markets and how that feeds into the real economy is my kind of focus, having spent 35 years in the city. I'm really worried, actually, economically, really worried. I've done quite a lot of analysis. If you look at unemployment rates over the last 40 years, the highest rate of unemployment was 11.8% in 1984, which was kind of peak of, if you like, Thatcher economic return reforms. Unemployment, it took sort of 5 years to go from 5.5% to 11.8%. Previous highs were around dot-com 92 and 07, 08, but never near 11.8. I think unemployment's going way beyond that, and I think quite quickly. So what the issue for me is, what's the economic philosophy that underpins the policy? Because if you don't have an economic philosophy, I'm not sure how you go about pursuing a sort of policy mix. And the reason I say that is a lot of the problems which has led to collapse in markets is because of the indebtedness that grew out of the policy response to the financial crisis of 08-09. So we had the crisis of 08-09. Central banks did what they needed to do to keep the economy afloat, which was kind of fine. But then when you take emergency measures, you then need to sort of go, right, okay, we've taken emergency measures to keep the thing alive. Now what are we going to do structurally and on the supply side to make sure we don't get that problem again? And that's just never happened. So I actually believe you need to allow businesses to fail. And the only way in which you get a genuine recovery is if you allow businesses to fail. Now, I know that is brutal, but it is the reality of economics and markets and also prosperity, because the parallel I draw is with Japan. So there's an expression in the markets which is the Japanification of markets. So Japan had they had a huge explosion of asset prices in the 80s, and you had house prices, and then you had a huge collapse in markets, and they've never really ever recovered 30 years later, where you have these structurally low interest rates, basically zero interest rates. And what that does, it has a huge distortive effect on the economy. So my question is really, what is the philosophy of the Treasury and the Chancellor? And it's not apparent to me what it is, because I tell you, what you can't do, given the size of the indebtedness, is say, right, we're going to tax a little bit more here, we're going to spend a little bit less there. That is not going to deal with any of the underlying economic issues we face. So, he's done the easy bit, which is basically giving people loads of money. The harder bit is going to be, what's your policy response to that? And to me, you need supply side reforms, which creates more efficiency into the economy. But those challenges we're going to know about pretty quickly. I think he'll do an emergency budget probably in October. But my sense from my concern is that everything I hear around the Treasury and the Bank of England, they are thinking about the problems we face now in the same framework as they thought about the problems in 08-09. And the point being, the policy response in 0809 was contributory to the problems we face now. So you've got to look at it in a different way. And it comes back to my point, Jonathan, about how government is run. Because if you keep on looking at things in the same way and doing the same policy mistakes, you're never going to get change.
In the world economy, Jake, it's sort of, I often say it's an interconnected spider's web. And until and unless countries around the world start to come back online, their trading partners won't benefit. For example, New Zealand, right now we hear lots of good things about New Zealand. It's sort of come out of it. But of course, until New Zealand's key trading partners come back online, New Zealand's economy is going to be stuck in a lower gear than it otherwise might be. We hear things about the East Asian industrial powers that they're starting to come back online, not least China. But of course, again, who are they selling to? If their major export markets are, in the tank, who exactly are they going to be selling their produce to? Factoring that all in and based on what you've just said, what do you think the UK economy is going to look like 12 months from now? And could there be some positive things which come from all this?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right about that interconnectedness. I actually think at that 50,000 foot level or 100,000 foot level, I think we're going to see fundamentally different economic models going forward. And I think whilst that will represent change, I think there's a lot of positives associated with it. So we are clearly going to see a disruption or changes to global supply chains that have built up over the last kind of 15, 20 years. So you're going to see less globalism, because I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, does one want to be as exposed to certain economies, obviously China, be for car parts or for medicines or PPE, whatever it happens to be. So I think it's one of the things we talked about in the Brexit Party. I don't want to talk about that too much, but the concept of strategic industries. So I think there's going to be a re-evaluation of that, because over the last few years there's been a big offshoring of production, and now I think there's going to be either nearshoring or reshoring. And I think if you said to people, right, these components are now going to be manufactured domestically rather than in China, but that means the product's going to be 10% more expensive. Well, actually, in the scheme of things, I think people understand that. But I do think there are a lot of positives. So I think that relentless globalization, which puts sort of real corporatism, putting corporate profits quarter on quarter above everything else, I think there's going to be a recalibration of that. I think reshoring, obviously, that means the opportunity to rebuild industries in the UK. I think there's going to be real changes in the way in the world of work. So that means more people are going to work at home, I don't know, a couple of days a week. I live and have worked in London all my life and in cities. That's going to be really good for suburban communities, because if people are at home a couple of days a week rather than only at the weekend, that supports local businesses, the digital economy, education and training. I think the university system is going to change substantially. I mean, it's just brutally expensive, and I've had 3 children who went to university. I mean, the number of contact hours are just kind of laughable. So I think actually there are a lot, as you're identifying, Jonathan, in the question, I actually think there are a lot of positives. But again, you need to harness that to an economic philosophy. So what is the fundamental economic philosophy that underpins that? But I agree with you, but it's also quite difficult to talk about the positives in the context of the sort of the human tragedy, but because we must keep that front of mind. But I agree with you. I think there are a lot of potential economic and social opportunities as well.
And of course, though you mentioned some issues with universities, of course, the UK arguably, I would say, definitely has the only higher education sector in the world that can really challenge the US, superstar higher education sector. And the UK really should be in pole position for some of the growth technologies of the next century. But leaving the coronavirus crisis for the time being, let's turn to all matters Brexit. You, of course, were a former Brexit Party MEP. You were there when when the curtain closed on the UK's time in the EU. Now, right now, the UK is in this transition period. The UK, however, during this transition period, remains in the single market and customs union. It is paying into the EU, but obviously has no representatives like yourself anymore. Kind of, you might say, taxation without representation. This is due to end in December. We have had calls, of course, for extension. We'll talk about that. We hear a lot about the negotiations between the UK and the EU, the trade negotiations led by David Frost on the UK side, Michel Barnier on the EU side, being done via video conferencing because of the coronavirus crisis, of course. Yeah. What has been your assessment so far of how those negotiations have gone?
Yeah, I think probably in common with most of those who Brexiteers, that actually the mood music, the noises, the public comments from David Frost have been absolutely excellent. You know, the speech that he gave initially when he sort of did that sort of kick-off speech, which I thought was great. But in all things, kind of the EU, there's always whilst the noises are better, we've heard all sorts of noises before. So, and obviously, as you know, as we are now, whatever it is, the 3rd of June, and we're going to know in sort of 4 weeks exactly where we stand. And I think, and it's going to change day by day. So whilst the noises are great, does this government really have the guts to go WTO if a deal is not going to be apparent? And now there's been some talk in the last couple of days around actually the 30th of June not being the definitive date, and actually maybe it'll be kind of September. I think that's extremely concerning, because if you are saying that is not the definitive date, then you're really signalling you're never going to go WTO, because you just do not have time to make those changes, in the last couple of months. Whilst the government has put up some new tariff schedules, they probably want to revise those. They may want to revise those. So to me, we are coming to a really pivotal day. Although from a legal point of view, it's less pivotal than people think, because although it's written into law, if they want to change the law, they can do it,
of course,
at any point. So this grand thing that around, we've embedded this in law, change that in an afternoon. Exactly. So it doesn't have the legal significance that people represent it does. But I think if they sort of start saying, well, really the end of June is not really the point where we take the definitive decision, then the EU will go, we knew they would blink again. And again, I don't really see an economic philosophy that sits behind that. And I'll tell you why I think that's important. It's right from the get-go, the EU's, but the position has been, the lazy position has been, I say lazy because it's not challenged, is that membership of the single market is economically a good thing. So the point Barnier has always been said is like, well, obviously it's a good thing to be single market. So it's really just a case of managing the downsides as a function of leaving the single market. I fundamentally disagree with that. Actually, the single market, I think, represents a handbrake on economic growth, prosperity, and unemployment. The reason I say that is this, is you can have a debate about where regulation should be calibrated. And I have no issue with saying that it's a perfectly reasonable position to say that regulation should be higher or lower. But what you cannot have is higher regulation without higher costs. It's a bit like saying there's a victimless crime. There is no cost-free regulation. So if you have higher regulation, which the single market requires, and standards, and the trouble is that people go, oh, you just want to slash regulation. No, I'm not saying that at all. But the obligations, the burdens of single market membership necessarily means it's more expensive, which means that it's more expensive to consumers. So it's an explicit higher cost associated with single market membership, putting aside the economic contributions. But there's a more subtle point, which is that cost of regulation creates barriers to entry. So there's an implicit cost because you get less competitors in industries. And that's what big businesses do, having been in Brussels. They spend millions making sure the barriers to entry remain high to protect their economic position. So I fundamentally do not agree that the single market means greater growth, increased prosperity. Look at youth unemployment in Greece, Italy, Spain, France. If that is a successful economic model, why do you have 40% youth unemployment in Greece? So this idea that it's of an economic benefit, I just fundamentally disagree with that first principles.
And Jake, you mentioned the possibility of the UK blinking. Now, at the moment, the UK is also engaged in trade negotiations with the United States, led by Liz Truss on the UK side, Robert Lighthizer on the US side. We've had a lot of talk about this. Some concerns have been thrown around about the lowering of agricultural standards. I'd like to speak about that and what you think about the potential of a UK-US trade deal. But what do you think the impact would be on the trade negotiations with the US if the UK blinked with the EU? What would be the response in Washington?
Yeah, absolutely right to bring the point up, and I missed it. Is absolutely, apart from what it means for the UK-EU negotiation, you're absolutely right, Jonathan, that everybody else has said, well, obviously we're negotiating on the basis, all these countries we're negotiating with on the basis of, right, we'll implement those new arrangements from the 31st of December or as soon as we can afterwards. Well, hang on, if you're going to delay that, so actually are you wasting my time as well? So I completely agree. I think it has really significant implications for trade deals that the UK naturally needs to do around the world. And so, but I'm afraid people say I'm skeptical, but I'm a realist. And you're going to leave on 31st of October, do or die. I'm done with the words actually. So I want to see exactly what happens at the end of this month, rather than just the kind of the bluster. I think we've all had enough of that.
Now, sticking with the trade deals, Jake, there will be those listening to our conversation who say, look, the UK walking away from this 450 million strong market on its doorstep, particularly if there's no trade deal. We've heard recently, I think, from a senior executive at Nissan about he's spoken about the threat of so-called no deal, or at least no trade deal, Brexit at the end of 2020. For those listening to us who say, look, if the UK walked away from this trading bloc right on its doorstep, there's no way that a trade deal with the US or renewed ties with the Commonwealth or any deal with Japan could ever begin to compensate for that loss. What would you say to that and the issue of a potential so-called WTO Brexit?
Yeah, well, again, that's why it comes to one's economic philosophy, is whether you think there's a political philosophy of wanting to be an independent sovereign state, and that's those discussions have been done to death, but of course it underpins what part of the government's negotiating position is. There's no point being an independent sovereign nation and then being a rule taker from another body. But there are so many examples in history of, particularly Commonwealth economies when the UK stepped away from those historic trading relationships, Australia and New Zealand, and they had to forge new paths when we joined the European community.
Yeah.
So the European Economic Community.
Yeah.
So I just think there are so many examples in history where there's always this implicit threat of what you're losing rather than the positive upside. And of course, there's going to be change, but that's what business should be about. It should be about embracing change and new opportunities. And that's why, going back to that first principles of, I'm really fundamentally challenging that idea that the economic benefits associated with the single market are what they are represented to be. They're largely a mirage. I mean, this is not even talking about the euro and its, all this kind of stuff. So, trade is about opportunities. I mean, big business, and that's really one that probably, we've got this sort of a corporatism where industry, economies are run solely around the needs of big business. And yet the SME sector is responsible for 50% of employment.
Yeah. But
SMEs do not have, large, lobbying budgets. So, but you have to be driven by political and economic philosophy and explain that, because otherwise you're always jumping around going, well, if Nissan say that or British Steel say that, then how do you ever chart a path? Which is why I think you need that really clear economic philosophy. And also it should tell us if the EU is so worried about a competitor on its doorstep, they clearly think that creates an opportunity for the UK. So it's almost endorsing our position of wanting to be outside the single market. Because if they had no concerns about that, they can see the opportunity for us, perhaps more than we can see it for ourselves.
Now, Jake, I'd like to go into the nuts and bolts of what's happening right now in the EU and Eurozone. But before we leave the negotiations, there have been calls on both sides of the channel to push back the end of the transition period. We've heard there's been some notes sent by Michel Barnier to UK opposition parties, excluding Labour. We've heard noises from figures in the SNP. We've heard noises from figures within the Labour Party that if we get a trade deal or if we don't, because of the coronavirus crisis, and it's been shoulders to the wheel on that, we naturally need to push back the end of the transition period. What would you say to those people?
Well, unfortunately, it's like the old thing of crying wolf, isn't it? The extreme Remainers have been dishonest about their motivations for the last 4 years. So maybe they are being honest about their concerns now, but the thing is, nobody believes it because they've been dishonest about their motivations for the last 4 years. And whenever you get, it's just so politically incompetent, Barnier writing to a bunch of opposition MPs. I mean, if that doesn't stiffen the resolve, just as a Brexiteer, you start to get worried that, oh, fantastic, keep going, Michel. You're just doing exactly the right thing. And it is one thing, well, Barnier might be very affable and polite and makes this big nonsense about this thing is how polite he is. It's like it's got nothing to do with anything. I actually think he has been an incompetent negotiator. And the reason I say that is this, because if you said to the EU 27 countries on the 31st of January, because we were in Brussels, so we saw it, are you where you wanted to be? They have ended up, their negotiating position, the mandate, so part the mandate and part the way he conducted the negotiations, has ended up with a way harder Brexit. Because, I mean, of course, they would never, ever have that sort of idea of self-reflection. But there is no question that Barnier, along with, Gina Miller is the ultimate hero of Brexit. Adonis, Clegg, Blair, the usual suspects. These people have been the heroes of Brexit. Whenever you get concerned, up pops Barnier with a letter to Ian Blackford and the rest. Happy days. I think he's negotiated actually really badly.
And Jake, let's you spoke a lot there about Michel Barnier. Let's talk a lot about the EU and the Eurozone. Even before the coronavirus crisis hit, there have been a budgetary dispute in the EU. Then, of course, we had the Corona bonds debacle, this debate over common debt issuance in the Eurozone. Once the coronavirus crisis hit, this was something that the Italian and Spanish government supported. It was opposed by mostly Northern European countries, the so-called more frugal countries. We've now had a Franco-German proposed fund. I think it's 500 billion euros in the form of grants. And this is something that has again come up against the opposition of the Dutch government, the Austrian government, a few in the Nordic countries as well. What is your assessment right now of the state of play in the EU and the Eurozone?
Yeah, so good question. And there's a lot of people saying, is this the Hamiltonian moment for the EU? Okay, so let's go to the human level and sort of go, okay, it is good that potentially there's going to be more support for poorer parts of the EU and Europe that have been particularly hit by COVID-19. So that is, so at a human level is a good thing. But actually, like most things in the EU, once you start to peel away the layers of the onion, actually it's much more around spin and marketing than it is about substance. As you said, you've got to distinguish between the loans and the grants. The grants is probably around 500 billion, but then it's linked to the budget, so it's over a multi-year period. You then, because it linked to the budget, it's kind of, okay, you're getting X billion new funds, but you've got to put that against your annual contributions. Net, when you actually look at, break down the numbers country by country over the time period, it represents a really small part of GDP. So I think actually is going to have minimal impact. Plus, you're sort of, a lot of people talk about the frugal four, but actually, the other thing to say is that what's proposed is the initial proposal. So unquestionably, it's going to get negotiated down. So because it's budget, it needs unanimity. So even at its maximum, I think it has a relatively minimal effect. And probably most importantly, it doesn't address any of the fundamental issues within the Eurozone. So, and let me just add to that point around the frugal four. Because of the way it's done through the budget, you've got net winners and losers. The two biggest recipients of the EU budget are Poland and Hungary. So not only have you got to deal with the frugal four, you may also see if those historical biggest net recipients now lose some of that, which they are likely to do if more funds are going to Italy and Spain, you then have the potential for more, because as you know, those two countries are on the EU naughty step. That's right. And in the context of the German Constitutional Court ruling, I mean, there's so many aspects to it. So net, I think actually it has, from an economic perspective, the implications are going to be minimal. It doesn't deal with the Eurozone problems. It creates other problems potentially with Poland and Hungary. And it's all about kicking the can, because it's about to be the German presidency from the 1st of July. Merkel doesn't want to blow up. She just wants to get to the end of her period as chancellor and push the problems. They're just pushing the problem down the road yet again.
Jake, you spoke about the Constitutional Court ruling. I want to touch on that in a moment. But before I do, I often characterize the EU and the Eurozone as a union without a demos. And what we've seen with the Corona bonds debacle, what we're seeing now with the frugal four, you don't have that sense of that embedded trust that you have within a country where richer areas are willing to subsidize poorer areas. Now, I wonder if the Euro Federalists will look at what has happened. They will say, well, of course, national politicians have to answer the national electorate. Wouldn't it be so much better if we had a common pan-European politicians that only have to answer to a common European electorate? I wonder if they will use the coronavirus crisis to catalyze a move towards federalism, because the alternative would be disintegration. And of course, in a sense, the Eurozone, you have a common currency, but you don't have a common government. And that is a fundamental flaw baked in right now to the bloc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, to be fair, I do actually think a federalist position is, a more honourable one than actually trying to arrive at that position by deceit, which is where I think a lot of people are. So Verhofstadt, obviously we don't agree with pretty much anything he says, but at least he's taking a position of principle.
Yeah, I agree.
Whereas a lot of people are just kind of, I'm reading a brilliant book by Ashoka Modi. It's called Euro Tragedy. It's absolutely brilliant. Going through the whole history of the creation of the Eurozone and all. I mean, it's all lies that were spun. It's quite extraordinary. But I think one of the fundamental, deceptions of the European Union, and it's why it's been quite effective in the States, is that it's always been represented of, oh, well, the European Union is just exactly the same as the United States. It's the coming together of those states.
Yeah.
And it is such, and it's a clever, I mean, it's simplistic, but it's such a clever deception, because there's just no comparison between the two, the language, it's
the history, everything.
The history, all the rest of it. It's just a straight out lie to say they're up parallel. So there's this expression, which in the Ashoka Modi book, is this concept of falling forward, of like, let's never actually be honest about federalist aims and actually put those to the test via, a plebiscite election or whatever it happens to be, because every time people reject it, we'll almost create something that we know has inherent flaws. So when the next problem arrives, we then stumble forward into a more federal structure. I mean, it's an unbelievable deceit. And whatever I thought about the anti-democratic structures of the European Union, probably haven't got time to, it is absolutely as bad and worse than I thought. And I can give some really specific examples of how anybody with a different view is suppressed within the European Parliament. It's shocking, actually, truly anti-democratic.
You mentioned, Jake, the constitutional court ruling in Germany. This obviously relates to the bond buying program. What are the implications of that? Do you think? I mean, I think it was Ben Habib and our chairman of Brexit Watch who said to me that it was almost like a sort of a vassal state of an empire rebelling against that empire. And of course, there could be implications. Other countries may jump on the bandwagon. What do you think are the implications of the German court ruling?
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, I tried a couple of times to write a piece on it, but it's just, it's too big and there's too many component parts. And I think something like that is dangerous to be oversimplistic about it. Well, absolutely, your point is, if German Constitutional Court is challenging the ECJ, then if you're other countries, if particularly Poland and Hungary, well, clearly that makes that more likely. I think it's also one of the sort of dangers around looking at political structures in this very legalistic way. Now, I don't claim to be, obviously I'm not a German constitutional lawyer, but one of the key bits in it, in the judgment, and it's fascinating. I mean, it's just such an interesting read, the summary of it anyway. Refers to this concept of competence, which is effectively saying, if you put aside the specific legalities, but the concept, the philosophy is basically saying, look, we effectively grant the competencies that we have as the German Constitutional Court to the higher court. So we submit ourselves to the higher court of the ECJ, but it's kind of implicit that all the things that we used to do, all the principles that we used to follow, we're passing those over to you to continue those, kind of that approach. And it gives lots of specific examples. So it's basically saying, well, obviously we're passing our competence to you, but on the provision that you continue to conduct yourself in an appropriate manner and consistent with how we did things. And that's where they have a real issue, is saying, not only did you, the ECJ, not require the ECB to do the tests that it should have done, there's lots of precedents of you previously doing that. So it's really, really fundamental. I mean, corona bonds is absolutely, completely off the, that's never going to happen. And so, to come back to your fundamental question, if you want federalism, put it to the test. Put it to the test of the, of 450 million people, whatever that means. But there's no appetite for it, which is why they have to continue with this deception in order to get where they're trying to get to, but without actually being honest about what they're trying to achieve.
Of course, we've seen Euroscepticism rise dramatically in Italy. I mean, this was a country that joined the European project very enthusiastically, broadly speaking. They saw it as a great thing, but of course Euroscepticism has risen, and the recent data shows it has actually risen across the entire bloc after the COVID-19 pandemic. Jake, in a broadcast with hosted by Nigel Farage, Ben Habib was also part of it. You spoke about the British involvement in the European Investment Bank. Now, I don't know as much as it's about you, so I'm going to let you sort of take the lead on this. What is the issue with Britain's involvement with the European Investment Bank? What does it mean vis-a-vis Brexit? And what does it mean if indeed there are any sovereign debt crises in the Eurozone?
Okay, so yeah, as you notice, I tend to, why use 5 words when I can use 500? So I'm going to try and do the opposite. Basically, the British people will be shocked to know that we're still on the hook for a Eurozone crisis. So, a lot of British people say, well, cool, we, by hook or by crook, we did the right thing not to go into the Euro. Absolutely right, but we're still on the hook. So basically, the way the liabilities associated with the European Investment Bank, which is, it's like a bank, it makes loans, when those loans are paid back, it kind of grows the capital of the bank. But if there's a problem, then the bank loses money, and we are joint and severally liable for the loans that were made during our membership of the European Investment Bank. So first big thing is we are still on the hook for if there's a problem. At any point, the UK can be called for 35 billion of callable capital. So at any point, they can turn around and say, as part of your historic membership, you need to send us 30 billion. The other thing that our negotiators did, which is so staggering, is although this operates like a bank, the EIB, it never pays dividends to the shareholders. So we had 16% of the bank. All we're getting back is the money we originally put in, but none of the retained profits. So the profits that were made were kept in the bank, not paid out to the shareholders. So our negotiators, the British government, decided to leave 7 billion quid of UK taxpayers' money behind. So we leave our profits behind. We get our original sum back over 12 years. We're callable for 35 billion at any point. And if there's a Eurozone crisis, we're on the hook for potentially hundreds of billions. And it's just absolutely horrendous. And nobody seems to know about it. Nigel tells us, I told Nigel the story. I bumped into Rishi Sunak. It was the day of the Saturday sitting of the Commons. He was absolutely charming. He was Chief Secretary of Treasury, number 2. He said, what have you been working on? He's charming, really nice guy. Nice to chat to, very friendly. And I said, I've been working on the situation at the EIB and the 7 billion we're leaving behind and all the rest of it. And he said to me, oh really? What's that about? He just didn't know. And he didn't know.
That's worrying.
It is when you're number 2 in the Treasury. But I don't blame him, because clearly somebody's not telling him. And it was pretty staggering. We met with some, I need to be careful about what I say here, but we met with some of the people who are involved in the negotiation in Brussels. And there was evident conflict of interests in terms of them truly representing British interests. And when we talked about, well, given these ongoing liabilities, what happens if there's a Eurozone fracture? And the guy looked at me and just went, what do you mean? As in, this could never, ever happen. And that's not his job, is to make judgments like that. You have to look at, if this happened, what would be the implications, and what do we do in order to protect the British people from that liability? They didn't do it.
This would never happen, Jake. Famous last words. What do you think are the risks of sovereign debt crises in the Eurozone in the foreseeable future?
Oh, I'm totally relaxed about it. I mean, all artificial financial systems fall apart. So there is no question. But I'm not somebody who'd put as long as it happens in my lifetime, I'm going to be happy. And the reason I say happy, people often, I was on a panel the other day who said, oh, you're always going on about this. I say, serious point. That's why you've got youth unemployment of 40% in Greece. The euro is a significant part of the problem. So I take no joy in the economic hardship that the Eurozone has delivered. So it will fall apart, but I can't put a time on it because it is being kept alive by, you know, political necessity. So but at some point that will definitely collapse. But for those who are, I don't manage money, so I'm not giving investment advice, but be careful being short the euro, because if you do have a fracturing of the euro, and let's say Italy and maybe other countries drop out, the euro will then probably be relatively stronger because it'll be more Deutschmark-like. So just as a sort of, for all those who are negative on the euro, I do say, negative on the eurozone, be careful about being short the euro, because you may well see a revaluation, because effectively the nature of the euro means that it's an undervalued currency for Germany. But net, artificial financial systems always fall over, and when the markets stop suspending reality, then it'll go, and it'll be something we can't predict. It's like, you know, you talk about black swan events in the markets. You know, nobody could have predicted COVID, so it's not going to be something obvious, but when it goes, it'll go very quickly.
Jake, pulling together everything we've discussed today, the coronavirus crisis, the UK response, the transition negotiations, the UK-US trade deal, and of course, the current state of the Eurozone and the EU. If you had one broad forecast or prediction over the next 6 months, 9 months, sort of the midterm, could be domestically, internationally, if you had one major prediction or forecast, what would it be?
Well, I think it's what I'd like to see, which is the government laying out an economic philosophy that seizes the potential from leaving the European Union immediately, and on WTO terms if we can't get a sensible free trade agreement, but also seizing some of the political, economic and societal changes that can come out of COVID. And I think the two things go together around, you know, an economic philosophy, but also, as you talked about, you know, training, education, digital economy, reshoring, localism. I know it's big that those two things happen together, but what an opportunity if you know, political and economic philosophy can be well articulated.
Sounds like a good positive note on which to end. So, Jake, Pugh, thank you for joining us today at Brexit Watch.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Jonathan.
And thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time.